Robert Eggers' highly anticipated Nosferatu has finally graced our screens, just over 100 years after the original F.W. Murnau film made Count Orlok a household name in cinema history. The legendary German director gave us the first ever vampire film, and I wonder if he realized that Nosferatu would eventually lead to this.
You're beautiful.
It certainly led to countless other Dracula adaptations, some much better than others. But only 3 major films have proudly taken on the moniker Nosferatu. The original 1922 film, Werner Herzog's 1979 adaptation, and now Eggers' 2024 take. In this video, I'm going to examine how Nosferatu has evolved with each adaptation roughly every 50 years. How has our perception of fear transformed since the silent era of cinema? Why does Nosferatu persist as a cultural touchstone when some of its other monster counterparts have been lost to time? What do these different versions tell us about the relationship between horror and the human condition? These are a few of the questions we're going to get the answers to, so don't go anywhere. At its core, Nosferatu tells a chilling tale of a vampire's curse and the destruction it brings to an unsuspecting town. The story begins with a real estate agent, Thomas Hutter, or a similarly named protagonist, depending on the adaptation, who is sent to a distant, eerie castle in the Carpathian Mountains to finalize a property sale with Count Orlok, a mysterious recluse. Hutter soon discovers that Orlok is not merely an eccentric nobleman, but a vampire, a creature of the night who feeds on human blood. After noticing Orlok's strange nature and almost being ensnared by his shadow, Hutter becomes trapped in Orlok's castle. Meanwhile, Orlok sets his sights on a new location, Hutter's hometown, and more importantly, his wife, Ellen, or Lucy. He boards a ship bound for the city, bringing with him death, disease, and a sense of foreboding dread. The climax revolves around Ellen, who uncovers Orlok's vulnerability, his obsession with her. Using herself as bait, she distracts the vampire until dawn, when the sun rises and the light of day destroys him. The act comes at a tragic cost, with Ellen sacrificing herself in order to save their community. This central narrative of an otherworldly predator wreaking havoc and a young woman with a strange connection to the occult rising to the challenge remains remarkably consistent across adaptations. What changes is how the filmmakers interpret and expand upon these beats, using them as a canvas to explore unique themes, atmospheres, and artistic styles. Before we start, I want to take a quick moment to ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you're enjoying it so far. By subscribing, you're not only supporting me, but you'll also get a say in what topics you'd like to see next. So hit that subscribe button and let's move on to why you clicked on this video in the first place. In 1922, Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, was made by German director F.W. Murnau and the studio Prana Film as an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Seeking to avoid copyright restrictions, the filmmakers altered character names and settings, transforming Count Dracula into the spectral Count Orlok and shifting the story from Victorian England to 19th century Germany. Despite these changes, Stoker's estate sued, resulting in a court order to destroy all copies of the film. Thankfully, several prints survived, ensuring the preservation of this landmark in cinema history. Nosferatu became a quintessential example of German expressionism, celebrated for its innovative use of lighting, shadows, and set design to create an enduring sense of dread. As the first vampire film, it laid the foundation for the horror genre and has continued to captivate audiences and filmmakers, solidifying its legacy as a horror masterpiece and an enduring work of early cinema. This film stands out as a distinctly gothic and psychological approach to the vampire mythos. Unlike later adaptations, it employs a 5-act theatrical structure, blending folklore with innovative visual storytelling that effectively captures the fears of post-World War I Germany. What truly sets Nosferatu apart is its atmospheric use of light and shadow, its depiction of Count Orlok as a deeply unsettling vampire, and its thematic exploration of plague, mortality, and sacrifice. In some ways, the film subverts gender roles of its time through Ellen's ultimate act of self-sacrifice, making her a central figure in the narrative's resolution. Nosferatu not only defined the cinematic vampire, but also laid the groundwork for modern horror tropes. The 5-act structure helps keep the pacing steady, making it a bit more theatrical. In Act 1, we meet the characters, Hutter and Ellen, the central people we're meant to care about. Ellen's basically an early prototype of the manic pixie dream girl. She's this ethereal character, but she's also tragic and romantic in a way that makes her stand out. There's a sense of depth to her that doesn't fully get explored due to it being a silent era film. We're introduced to the inciting incident, Hutter having to go on this business trip. Hutter's journey to Orlok's castle is full of weird, unsettling signs, people warning him of the monster, strange encounters, creepy landscapes, but he just laughs it all off. Everything is setting up this slow burn of tension, and it works really well. We get a sense of how long the journey is. He takes a horse, then a carriage, then walks across the mountain to get there. The visual effects are obviously dated, but I think they still work. It laid the groundwork for what this looks like in terms of showing Orlok's powers, showing his super speed and magical abilities with cinematic tricks. It's not the smoothest, but for in-camera techniques, they're effective. The film gives us a good sense of how far they're going and how long it takes. Act 1 ends when he arrives at the vampire's castle. Act 2 begins with him encountering the monster. The tone shifts dramatically when he finally enters the castle. Even after Hutter meets Orlok, he's somewhat calm, eating and drinking, totally ignoring the fact that he's in a dangerous situation. Hutter's very chill. He doesn't believe in the supernatural and often thinks it's just a dream. The contrast between his nonchalant ignorance and Ellen's mystic awareness works well. He's such a himbo, just coasting through life with no seriousness whatsoever. He's not skeptical about any of the warnings he's given. All of it just feels like one big joke to him. His goal is to make enough money to buy Ellen a house, and that's it. He's just a guy who sees a golden opportunity and goes for it. I honestly like this characterization of Hutter the best out of the three. Him being so unserious adds another dimension to the story that's missing in the other films. Nosferatu's appearance is a big part of what makes this film iconic. It's such a unique take on what a vampire looks like. Tall and gaunt with these strange features, potentially the most unique depiction of a vampire in cinema, and for the time it certainly was scary, and by today's standards it's at the very least unsettling. The features don't look real, but they don't look completely fake either. When I see Orlok, I don't see an actor playing the character. It almost feels like the vampire itself. His height, gauntness, long fingers, and nails are all timelessly scary characteristics. With this being the first vampire film, it doesn't have a reference point to base the look on. It's taking key elements from folklore and bringing them to life on screen in a way that's effective for an audience of that period. Act 2 also establishes that Ellen, with her love or some kind of supernatural pull, is able to distract the vampire to save her beloved. Ellen's performance is important because there's no real explanation for how she's able to call out to the monster or sense Hutter's in trouble. It's in the performance that we see her so attuned, so intoxicated by love that she can call out to the darkness. It's a very gothic idea that's not fully fleshed out, but conveyed well enough through the performance. Ellen senses evil way before Hutter does. She's aware of the danger, which adds a layer of complexity to her character. She's not just a damsel waiting for Hutter to come save her. She's actively aware of what's going on and saves him from danger. It's rare for films of this time, especially in horror, where women are often just there to be scared or saved. It establishes a connection between Ellen and Orlok and a desire for her on the Count's part. Act 2 ends with Orlok leaving and heading toward their town, Visburg. Act 3 delves into other horrors like plague and occultism, which takes us away from the central characters, which is much needed. Both Hutter and Count Orlok are rushing to get back to Germany with no quick way of getting there. If we didn't explore a new setting in this act, it wouldn't have been as engaging. Act 3 happens on a ship, and we see the shipmates getting picked off, almost like a slasher movie. It's interesting seeing one of the earliest horror films laying the foundation for modern horror subgenres. The stakes get higher as Orlok and Hutter make their way toward Visburg. Terror begins to spread beyond just our two main characters. The ship arrives in town carrying death with it. It's a brilliant way to expand the story and make Orlok's terror bigger than just one couple. The plague becomes a very real, tangible force that ties back to the film's broader themes. In Act 4, we explore the horrors and fears of the time period. The rats are clear symbols of the plague and post-World War I fears, including the Spanish flu and even further tying back to the Black Plague. It's meant to cause fear in the audience of 20th century Germans. Let's talk about Knock for a second. His descent into madness, his occultist, creepy behavior is still relevant to horror movies today. The way he's presented as a servant to the supernatural makes him feel like a vessel for evil. The performance is great because it's so unhinged. In horror films, you want to see a character that's completely off the rails, and Knock is reveling in the horribleness of everything, which is scary in and of itself, seeing someone so deranged. His scenes really ramp up the psychological horror. It's not just about the monster, it's about the madness and fear that infects the characters around Orlok. This film iconically uses a lot of shadows, or chiaroscuro, which ties into the theme of the vampire, who uses shadows as part of its power to engulf its prey and kill, invoking fear. The idea of having a shadow animate and act as a catalyst for this monster's power is very interesting. For a medium in its infancy, they're able to do impressive things. The settings have different tones to them. The tone inside the castle is very gothic and dark, evoking a strong supernatural feeling. The ship, while less gothic, still fits the horror aesthetic, with people dropping like flies. We get a good sense of geography in the film, especially with Visburg. It was made for German audiences. The town is meant to feel like it could be any German town, where the audience could look at it and feel like it could be their town, their home. In the final act, we have Ellen's sacrifice. She doesn't sit there and wait for someone to save her. It's her own selflessness and purity that eventually defeat Orlok. It's her love that ultimately saves the day. She drives the narrative forward, even if it's in a heartbreaking way. Ellen's role as savior is compelling because she's one of the only characters who is aware of the true danger and exercises agency to deal with it. However, her depiction is still a product of its time, reflecting dated notions of femininity, while still granting her a degree of agency. Her self-sacrifice, though heroic, aligns with early 20th century ideals that celebrated women as virtuous and selfless martyrs, often defined by their willingness to suffer for others. Ellen's agency is limited to a single fatalist act that reinforces the trope of women as sacrificial saviors, leaving little room for her to exhibit autonomy beyond her role as protector of her husband and community. While her choice to confront Orlok is undeniably brave and pivotal to the film's resolution, it ultimately underscores her function as a passive vessel for moral and emotional salvation, rather than a fully realized character with personal depth. You also get the sense that the vampire's relationship with Ellen has sexual subtext to it. The idea that the blood of a virgin or innocent is more enticing, which is why he goes to her. She opens up to him and he enters. There's subtext there. He grabs her heart through his shadow, which also looks like he's groping her. The film is obviously limited by the technology of its time, relying on light, shadow, and performances. It's not overly reliant on title cards or descriptions, but it uses them effectively. The dialogue often has tongue-in-cheek humor, using dramatic irony to joke about the vampire, which would have been funny to an early 20th century audience. It builds the atmosphere well and is gothic through and through. The legacy of this film in horror is huge. The vampire genre wouldn't be the same without it. It's a pivotal horror film, and iconic in terms of visual effects, especially the makeup and how Orlok looks. Despite being an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula, Nosferatu has become its own entity. That's a testament of how important it is to cinema and how iconic it remains. Werner Herzog's Nosferatu The Vampyre emerged as a project deeply rooted in Herzog's reverence for cinematic history and his desire to reinterpret the silent era classic for modern audiences. As a pivotal figure in the new German cinema movement, Herzog sought to pay homage to F.W. Murnau's classic, which was in public domain. Herzog considered Murnau's work the greatest German film ever made and aimed to preserve his expressionist roots while imbuing it with his own existential and philosophical vision. The project came together during a period of renewed interest in Gothic horror, with Herzog assembling a formidable cast, including Klaus Kinski as the vampiric Count Dracula, Isabella Gianni, and Bruno Ganz. Upon release, the film was celebrated for its atmospheric beauty, thematic depth, and its ability to capture the eerie romanticism of the original. Over time, Herzog's Nosferatu has been recognized as a seminal work in horror cinema, bridging the gap between silent-era expressionism and contemporary psychological horror, and solidifying its legacy as a reimagined classic. This film stands out as a haunting and poetic reimagining of the 1922 classic, merging gothic and romantic aesthetics with 1970s sensibilities. While faithful to the silent-era masterpiece in many ways, Herzog infuses the story with a grounded realism, psychological depth, and existential themes that align with the era of New German cinema. This adaptation humanizes Count Dracula, portraying him as a tragic, tortured figure rather than a purely monstrous villain, while also modernizing the roles of its characters, particularly Lucy, whose agency and struggles reflect early feminist ideas. The film's painterly visuals, atmospheric pacing, and thematic complexity elevate it beyond traditional horror, transforming it into an art house meditation on mortality, longing, and the nature of evil. The film opens with gaunt, undead-like statues that feel ancient and deeply gothic. The shaky camera adds a cinema verite quality, grounding these eerie images in reality. Then there's a slow, meditative shot of a bat, followed by Isabella Gianni's iconic scream, a harrowing image that stays with you. but instead of horror-like or gothic music, the score is sweet, calming, and poetic. The imagery throughout the film leans into a romantic aesthetic. The white walls of the apartment, the soft, almost painterly shots. These elements create a serene, dreamlike quality that makes the horror feel more as existential than visceral. There's more of a focus on realism in this adaptation in terms of the pacing, the look, and the feel. It's still gothic and romantic, but the stylistic elements are grounded in realism. It's treating the source material in the way a 70s horror film would. More atmospheric, a bit more artsy, with a bit of camp sprinkled in. It's taking itself seriously, but also feels light and flowing. In terms of the lighting, it does a lot of what the original did, using shadows and harsh light. The film is mostly faithful to the original, borrowing dialogue almost verbatim in some scenes, but Herzog makes interesting changes in characterization. Hutter, for instance, now Jonathan Harker, is no longer the laughing, boyish husband. In true 70s fashion, he's become a stoic, noble leading man, self-serious but still relaxed. Ellen, or Lucy as she's called in this version, is also different. She's less defined by intense love for her husband, and more by a haunting darkness. Her intuition seems attuned to the foreboding atmosphere surrounding her, adding an extra layer of melancholy to her character. This version deals more with psychological horror, touching on the Count's point of view and how his existence is painful and horrific. It's less about him being purely a monstrous threat, spreading disease and killing the people we care about, and more about showing the pain of not being able to die, being an immortal who kills for survival. There's still supernatural elements, but they're done poetically rather than as straightforward magic. It's about the subtext, what's beneath the surface. The vampire is used as a metaphor for existentialism, war, and other modern issues, all touched upon in a way that's more complex than the original. The big evolution here is humanizing the vampire, giving him human emotions like longing and desire. The performance is haunting because this is an undead being who used to be human and is now beyond the veil, looking through it and wanting to come back, but it's simply not possible. In this adaptation, you see the Count trying to connect to his humanity again, but he can't. Klaus Kinski's Dracula is a striking departure. He looks monstrous, his alabaster skull floating ominously in the shadows. The handheld camera work gives the film a raw, unsettling edge. This Dracula is tortured and menacing, but also deeply sad. He monologues about his existence, lamenting his eternal suffering. It's a fitting change. In the original, the vampire is driven purely by carnal needs, but when you give him a voice, you have to give him humanity. This film was made during the era of New German cinema, a movement characterized by its bold artistic experimentation. While firmly rooted in German filmmaking, Herzog's Nosferatu reflects this movement's embrace of complex, morally ambiguous characters and narratives. Orlok, as depicted here, embodies this ethos. He's not simply a villain or a monster, but a morally ambiguous figure, neither a traditional anti-hero nor a clear antagonist. The film resists telling the audience how to feel about him, leaving room to view him as a tragic figure, a villain, or even a sympathetic character. This nuanced portrayal reflects New German cinema's drive to explore shades of gray in human nature and storytelling, departing from the clear-cut dichotomies of good versus evil. The 70s were all about reinventing cinema, and with a prolific director like Werner Herzog, his approach was to reinvent the story while paying homage to the original. It's like a timestamp, showing how far cinema had come and how it had changed. This adaptation is pure European art cinema. It fits perfectly within the late 70s context, releasing just before The Shining and Possession, two films that also redefine horror through an art house lens. It functions less as a horror film and more as a meditation on horror. There are many long shots, and the music isn't always menacing, transporting you to this romantic era. It's at the intersection of romantic and gothic art, with an almost documentary-like feel. The result is a haunting, poetic reimagining of a classic tale. The settings are similar to the original, but some things are flipped on their head. For example, the choice to make the castle white is interesting because it's the opposite of gothic, stripping away the dark, jagged aesthetics we might expect. Instead, Herzog flirts with gothic imagery while grounding the story in soft, romantic visuals. It feels old and parochial, but real. The town where Jonathan stops on his way to Dracula's castle looks more realistic and natural compared to the original. It feels like a real place where people live, rather than a constructed set. A nice touch is having an old lady, worried about his well-being, hand Jonathan the book on vampires when he stays the night. It's a small but important detail that logically explains how he comes to learn more about vampire lore. His journey to the castle feels meditative and transcendental, but as Jonathan gets closer, the music shifts, becoming darker. Herzog pays homage to the original in subtle ways. The actors hold themselves stiffly, echoing the mannerisms of old cinema acting. This slight vaudevillian theatricality feels like a deliberate nod, balancing the naturalistic style of the film with its roots in the silent era. Silent films had to convey as much as possible visually, so performances were highly expressive and over the top for storytelling purposes. This film does that too. It's expressive enough that you could watch it on mute and still understand what's going on. It's definitely a nod to German expressionism. The dialogue gives key insights, but the focus is still on being visually expressive. Lucy's conversation with Dracula is a notable addition. She's the only innocent character who can commune with him, emphasizing her unique role as the one who must confront the Count. Jonathan returns to Germany infected by the vampire's curse. The power of the Count has corrupted him, incapacitating him, and justifying why only Lucy can solve the problem. In the original, Ellen realizes she's the only one who can save the town and sacrifices herself. In this version, Lucy tries to find a solution through others who may be able to help. She tries to share what she's learned and offer a solution, but she's dismissed by the men around her. She's belittled and told it's all in her head, reflecting the reality of the times that the original shied away from. Her experiences with misogyny gives Lucy's agency a modern drive. There's far more sexual tension in the scene where Lucy lures the Count, heightening the intimacy and stakes of her sacrifice. Their strange sexual connection seems to hint at Dracula's longing to return to his humanity. Kinski's performance communicates his struggle to approach Lucy's humanity and bring himself to touch her. The whole scene is full of subtext and can be interpreted in so many ways, which is what makes it so brilliant. Lucy dies with a smile on her face, a chilling and bittersweet image. The change of having Jonathan become a vampire in the end feels like a modern horror twist, where the cycle continues. It's one of the only key changes of the story. I'm not the biggest fan of this change, but it brings the story full circle in a way that the other films don't. This film holds a unique place in cinematic history, bridging the gap between the gothic terror of its predecessor and the introspective sensibilities of 70s European cinema. Its meditative style invites the audience to linger in its haunting dreamlike atmosphere, while its grounded filmmaking lends a stark realism to the supernatural tale. The serene imagery, whether it's the stillness of the plague-ridden town or the breathtaking shots of the Carpathian Mountains, at the heart of it all is Herzog's beautifully poetic reimagining of Count Dracula, not merely as a monster, but as a tragic existential figure yearning for connection and cursed by his immortality. This layered portrayal, combined with the film's mesmerizing tone, ensures that Herzog's Nosferatu is a film that truly stands apart from other adaptations of this iconic story. Robert Eggers' Nosferatu emerges as a highly anticipated reimagining of the tale. Eggers, celebrated for his meticulous attention to historical detail in films like The Witch and The Lighthouse, channels his fascination with folklore and psychological tension into this adaptation. Initially announced in 2015, the project endured years of uncertainty, including a period when Eggers himself questioned whether it would ever be made. It wasn't until September 2022 that significant progress was made, with Bill Skarsgård and Lily Rose Depp cast in the lead roles. Nosferatu revisits the gothic essence of Murnau's original while integrating contemporary cinematic techniques to reach a modern audience. This adaptation redefines the vampire archetype through a historical lens and fully delves into the unexamined subtext of the original. While the original is a minimalist silent era masterpiece, and the 1979 remake embraces a poetic interpretation, Eggers' adaptation dives headfirst into contemporary horror aesthetics, blending modern art house influences with visceral body horror. This version creates a narrative rich in historical detail and psychological depth, while embracing themes of sexuality, agency, and depravity. With stunning visuals, modern pacing, and complex character portrayals, particularly Lily Rose Depp's multifaceted Ellen, Eggers crafts a Nosferatu that is a provocative evolution of the source material. Wow, so this film is in a whole different dimension than the other two films. It's more in line with the new art house horror wave. Think Midsommar, Hereditary, and obviously Egger's previous films. The pacing, the sound design, and overall cues stay true to modern studio horror films. Ones that are designed to jump scare you, which has been a mainstay of the genre. It's interesting seeing an adaptation of a film that basically originated the horror genre, now framed with these specific things we now associate with modern horror. Yet, for most of cinema history, horror wasn't particularly like that. There were no jump scares in the previous two films, which shows how recent a lot of the conventions we associate horror with are. The pacing is very different here. It stretches the story. The original is so bare and simple and full of subtext. With this adaptation, it's like Eggers is pulling out all the subtext from the original story and just smearing it on the screen, throwing it at you. He's taken his interpretation of the subtext and made it canon, making the implicit explicit, which I think is actually a good way to adapt a silent film for modern audiences. The original simplicity and its brief 95-minute runtime make it so there's no time to flesh out the characters, give them emotional arcs, or make them feel truly real. Eggers really takes his time, fleshing out everything he can and breathing life into the story. That's mostly a good thing. This is where we get the body horror version of Nosferatu. It's disgusting, nasty, horrifying, and it works. It's leaning heavily into supernatural body horror, which is pretty popular in horror right now. You want to shock the audience and get a reaction. Orlok's design is almost Cronenberg level of grotesque. It makes sense. All the creative decisions Eggers made for this film make sense. I don't fully agree with all of them, but I get where they're coming from. The whole idea of Count Orlok as an undead being is done really well. It blends the vampire with the zombie, which works. They're somewhat similar. The way Orlok looks and breathes, he's a decaying undead body. That idea is communicated really well through the body horror and the performance. Bill Skarsgård Nosferatu is a modern take on the monster. He's grounded, imposing, and ugly, which explains why he's being lusted over, kind of like Pete Davidson. Obviously, you want him to be scary, and I believe that was Eggers' goal. Any director willing to take on the challenge of remaking Nosferatu after seeing the original must want to make it genuinely scary for modern audiences. But okay, I have to get this off my chest. Personally, I do not like how Orlok looks in this film. After watching the original in the 1979 version, I just can't accept a Count Orlok without the pointy teeth. That is the character. Removing the teeth and giving him a mustache. Look, I get it. It's Eggers pulling from history, Transylvania, and Vlad the Impaler, where the whole Dracula myth comes from. Okay, Eggers fans, I can hear you typing already. And just for the record, I pieced that together on my own. So yeah, I get the idea, and it's not a bad idea. But personally, I think it's kind of blasphemous to give him this huge mustache that covers his lips. You don't even get the teeth. No vampire teeth at all. That was a huge mistake in my opinion. It doesn't take away from the film being really good, but it's a big miss for me. Okay, moving on. Orlok is completely different here. He's the manifestation of evil, perversion, malice, violence. He's a true monster, a malignant presence. Cut to Kendall saying that. He's surprisingly one-dimensional as an antagonist. After getting a deep philosophical take on Orlok with Herzog's film, I expected a similar take on the character, humanizing him and fleshing him out. But no, he gets the Hollywood scary monster treatment, which works, but he's honestly not all that scary. With the character design and making his relationship with Ellen far more sexual, we lose some of the scare factor, which is a real shame. I just think we lose the subtlety of Count Orlok. You know, the reason I found him interesting in the original was that he didn't feel like the typical scary monster in a movie. His facial expressions and his unique presence are captivating. I just wish the character was taken in a different direction personally. Something a bit more faithful to the original, somewhere in the middle, because I feel like there's nothing of the original character in this version of Count Orlok, apart from a few lines. This version of the film touches on possession and mental illness, like melancholy, which is a fitting place to go with the material. That's an area we like to explore in horror films these days, the darkness of the mind and the depravity of human nature. So going that direction with Ellen was really interesting because in other depictions, she's like this patron saint, pure, virginal, and untouched. This is very much not that. It kind of harkens to Rosemary's Baby and obviously The Exorcist. You can see Eggers connecting the dots of Nosferatu and the history of horror films, which is pretty cool. The cinematography in this version humanizes it more. It makes a distinct choice to make it feel more modern in terms of the film language. Eggers is trying to place this story in a real time and place in history, and that works really well. The way he shoots it brings it to life in a way that feels like it actually could have happened. It's using the technology we currently have to its full potential. All the locations are very distinct, and with a bigger budget and modern technology, this is the best this story has ever looked. The original was on a very low budget, and even the 1979 version was only made with about $1 million. This is the first one with a bigger budget and more at its disposal. Visually, it's definitely the definitive version. It's paying homage to the original, but it's a huge upgrade in terms of how we visually experience the story. We get the full gothic splendor that the source material was longing for. The way it creates unease and is tied to how the camera interacts with the space. There are several shots where the camera pans 360 degrees, slowly revealing what's going on, and I noticed that making me feel really uneasy throughout the film. The visuals help us understand the Count's power more. In the other films, you don't really get why any of this stuff is happening, like how Ellen is able to communicate with him. There's so many unanswered questions, but you kind of just go with it. The performances are a big part of what makes it more modern as well. This one only subtly references the silent era, particularly with Knox's character. The performances are grounded, emotional, and based on reality. It's grounded in the way people would have talked and acted back then. Speaking of performances, once again we get a very different take on Hutter. In the original, Hutter is a laughing, unserious himbo. Then in the Herzog version, Jonathan is more stoic, relaxed, with a hint of sensitivity. In this latest version, Nicholas Holt's Hutter is something completely new. A whimpering coward. He's just as clueless as the original, but without that playful, jokey energy. This Hutter is truly helpless, and even when he manages to get himself out of trouble, it's not out of bravery, it's just pure fear. This is the first version where Ellen actually compares her husband to the Count, belittling Hutter for not being able to please her, both in bed and in their lives. It's a pretty significant shift, showing how little agency Hutter has and how much he pales in comparison to Orlok. I like Holt's performance. He's one of my favorite actors since Skins, one of my favorite shows ever. But this take on Hutter isn't my favorite. He doesn't really get much to do in the story, and without much agency, he ends up serving more as a vehicle for the audience fright. In a way, it feels like a subversion, turning the male lead into a character who's more like a stereotypical female lead in horror, scared and helpless. However, it makes Hutter hard to connect with. On top of that, Holt and Depth have very little chemistry, which makes it hard to buy into their love story. In this version, Knock is one of the only characters that stays quite true to the original. He's the one mainstay that you can't really change in an adaptation. Knock's character is so wild and unhinged that it's almost impossible to alter him without losing the essence of what makes him so compelling. And since his psychosis is so extreme, it actually makes sense for his performance to be more expressionistic and pull from that silent era over-the-top style. I absolutely love Knock's scenes in this version. The way they're shot and performed really brings the character to life in a way that feels definitive. You can really see the full extent of his occultism and depravity. He truly embodies the dark, chaotic energy that consistently permeates the character. Previously minor side characters get properly fleshed out, which really adds to the story. Friedrich and Anna get a lot more screen time, which helps make them full characters. Their development answers questions about who they are to the Hutters and gives us a look into the burden they bear by hosting Ellen. I really loved Aaron Taylor-Jones's portrayal of Friedrich, this ultra-posh 19th century man. Some people think it's too cartoonish and unrealistic, but I'd say go listen to some of the first voice recordings made by wealthy aristocrats, because that's really how they sounded. He nailed it and brought a lot of life to the character. His relationship with Hutter being his wealthy friend and benefactor, and his growing stress over caring for Helen as her condition worsens is well conveyed. That said, Friedrich might have a bit too much screen time. The pacing struggles in the latter half of the film, and I think it brings too much focus on Friedrich's discussions with Bulwer, whom we'll get to shortly, especially when he ends up dying off screen in a pretty questionable way. If you know, you know. It just felt like an odd choice, but his grief at Anna and his children's funeral and his emotions there were really powerful and moved me quite a bit. Anna is more of a side character, but I think Emma Corrin's performance was well done. Love her. I'm kind of obsessed with this whole cast. What works best with Anna is her relationship with Ellen. By expanding that friendship, the film makes us believe why the Hardings would go to such lengths to help Ellen. That convincing bond makes their motivations feel real. As for Professor Bulwer, he's a new addition to the story altogether. I don't mind his inclusion. I mean, any film benefits from Willem Dafoe, right? But his character is a bit of an exposition dump, constantly musing about the occult and explaining things. And for a side character, he steals a lot of the spotlight, and honestly, I feel like he's in the film more than Hutter himself. His big speeches are great, but they remind me of Dafoe's grand monologues in The Lighthouse. As amazing as Dafoe's delivery is, nothing can really top those scenes in The Lighthouse, and that comparison makes his speech feel a bit overblown. I think the focus on him is a bit much. Lily Rose Depp absolutely gives her best performance here by like a million miles. She really popped off. The way they adapted this character is the opposite of how I feel about Orlok. The direction they took took Ellen in was really great. That character was admittedly a nothing character in the original. The only thing of note she did was sacrifice herself. But here they managed to humanize her and make her feel like an actual person, someone multifaceted and complex. She's dark, sweet, depraved, and deranged all at once. Lily Rose completely brings that to life, in a way I don't think many other actresses could. And visually, she's perfect for this. Somehow she looks like an old school 1920s actress in this. I never thought I'd say that. Also, she's Johnny Depp's daughter, so of course she fits into that gothic vibe. Honestly, I'm surprised this is her first gothic film. The film leads way more into the sexual side of things too. If the 1979 version hinted at sexual connotations, this one fully embraces them. It's uncomfortable at times, for sure. Do I think it was the best choice? I'm not 1000% sure, but it makes sense. Those connotations were always there, so I guess if you're going to address them, you might as well go all the way. That's something I appreciate about this film. It just fully goes for it. Since the original, there's always been that lingering question. Does Orlok want to f*** Ellen? Did she f*** the vampire? And this version makes it canon that she did in fact f*** the vampire. I don't know what it says about our society that we can now say with our full chest, yeah, she's f***ing the vampire. Maybe it's a sign of how hypersexualized things are now. Or maybe it's more about giving female characters the freedom to be sexual and embrace their sexuality, which I'm all for. What I do think is cool is how this flips the narrative of Ellen as a savior. Instead of being this pure self-sacrificing figure, she's almost an anti-hero. And we don't get a lot of female anti-heroes. She's not just saving the town, she's also the reason the plague came in the first place. And it's not purely to save her husband. It comes from a much darker place. She's deeply connected to the supernatural and occult. And it's nice that we finally get an explanation for that. It feels like a much more rounded portrayal. Ellen comes across as a real person with her own agency, flaws, and virtues. As I said before, this movie takes the base story of the original Nosferatu and weaves it into the larger history of horror cinema. You can see the influences from iconic horror films, which themselves all trace back to Nosferatu. It's like Eggers is retracing the roots of the genre. He's sowing the seeds that were already there in the original but weren't fully explored. This adaptation feels like a culmination, a way of saying this is where it all began and here's where we've landed. While I don't think this adaptation is perfect, it's definitely the most visually striking version of Nosferatu we've seen. Some of the many changes, particularly in fleshing out the characters, add some much needed humanity and depth to the story, making it feel more grounded. This adaptation truly feels like Eggers' own film, and that's the best thing you can say about a remake. It has a stamp of authenticity and ownership. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it stands apart and offers something new while still honoring the legacy of the original. Over a century, Nosferatu has evolved from Murnau's haunting silent masterpiece in 1922 to Herzog's meditative reinterpretation in 1979, and now Eggers' atmospheric and historically infused vision in 2024. Each film reflects the era of its creation, from the innovative expressionism of early cinema to the philosophical introspection of new German cinema, and finally the meticulous craftsmanship and genre-blurring trends of contemporary filmmaking. These films not only underscore how cinema is transformed in its technical and narrative sophistication, but also demonstrate the enduring power of Nosferatu's mythic tale. A story malleable enough to embody the fears, desires, and artistic sensibilities of vastly different generations. As the medium continues to evolve, embracing new technologies and storytelling paradigms, Nosferatu will hopefully endure as a cornerstone of horror, a reminder of cinema's capacity to reinvent the past, while exploring timeless themes of mortality, desire, and the monstrous within. What do you think about these three versions of Nosferatu? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, I truly appreciate it. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. For those who want to support the channel further and get exclusive content, consider joining my Patreon. And if you're into music, be sure to check out my band. One of our songs is playing now. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.